We come to the dramatic conclusion of the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah today at the end of Genesis 19 as we look at verses 23 to 29 and see the fire and brimstone as it's traditionally understood coming down and Abraham watching from his location near the oaks of Mamre. So as we begin here, the parallels between the flood and the Sodom stories that we've been noting all along are even more specific here. The description of the destruction, the use of the verb for rain to come down here, the remembering as we see, and the as we saw earlier, the symbolic shutting of a door, highlighting as God had said, no more destruction by water, but now the fire. And as we'll see, unlike the flood story, which is never repeated and never threatened to be repeated, the destruction of the earth and God's judgment by fire and sulfur is repeated a number of times, whether that was about historical Babylon or in the book of Revelation about empire in the symbol of Babylon, as we'll see momentarily. So as we look at our immediate scene, the key words that continue to take place here are cities and, interestingly, plain. We had not seen the plain as an issue before, but now it's come up because that's where Lot first settled. And so perhaps to our surprise, although the judgment was primarily on Sodom, and then Gomorrah is added here, even though Gomorrah was not at all a part of the story. It's certainly a part of the tradition. It's hard to say the word Sodom without saying the word Gomorrah, although the citizens of Gomorrah's name never became a noun or a verb in English, and we know nothing about it. It's never actually in the story. But be all that as it may, the cities of the plain are now added to it, which is to say the entire area that's where the living was easy, whether that's, as we see in the books of Samuel, where the Philistines were, who battled with Saul and David, or others throughout the ages that were willing to fight for the land where the living was relatively easy. And so God's people called, which is to say all people, called to live on the earth where perhaps it's more challenging in the short run, but avoids all the war and destruction that we see here in the long run. And we'll see how even this closing scene highlights that contrast. So we're also going to note that this scene is phrased with a number of rare or unique words. I'll put this element up here now. It's the way a number of biblical authors frame around a certain story to highlight its relative uniqueness. So for example, when Moses meets God at the burning bush, the word for the burning bush is only there. It's not like you should be looking around for more burning bushes. And although there, as we'll see, there are other references to sulfur, etc. throughout, all these different words are either unique in Genesis or unique in the Torah, or almost unique in the entire Hebrew Bible, highlighting the way this description is meant to be something that's special and not just generic, like so many of the other descriptions in the prophets of eventual eschatological destruction that call upon common tropes, and we hear the same language repeated, including in apocalyptic literature in the New Testament and beyond. So let's leave this up here so we can see this. One thing we didn't look at was the structure so far, so I just wanted to highlight we're reaching the conclusion here, and this is parallel up here to the visitors looking towards Sodom using that word, which we only see in those two places, as we'll see in one other place in Genesis. But if we put this version of it up, we can follow some of the key words. So it begins with the sun had risen on the earth, and this is already a rare thing. As I noted here, this is not a rare, unique word, but the images. The sun will only come out one other time on Jacob, highlighting what some have called the end of his dark night of the soul that began with the sun setting in 28:11 and rising in 32:31. So plainly the sun coming out here is symbolizing a new beginning. It's actually not a new day, because a new day begins in the biblical notion with sunset. So sunrise is not a new day, but it is certainly a new beginning of the light coming. And curiously, it says it's risen here. It came out, which is not clear what it came out from. But notice the language of coming out of Sodom throughout. So the sun is matching and coming out. And here it's on the Eretz, but a little later we'll see on the Adamah here, what grows in the ground. So a contrast between the Eretz and the Adamah here. So it rose when Lot came to Zoar, the little town that he was going to settle in, although he won't end up there, as we'll see. This image here of raining on Sodom and Gomorrah fire and sulfur echoes some of the wisdom literature here, which doesn't have fire and sulfur as stuff. It focuses on a slightly different image, but we're going to look in a minute at how this image plays out across other traditions beyond. And so raining on Sodom and Gomorrah, and I want to highlight two elements of that. It's recalling the raining in the flood story earlier, and the only other use of rain was the absence of rain in the garden. There was as yet no rain. um, on Sodom and Gomorrah. And Gomorrah, again, noted here last in 1820, but now included. Sulfur, garith here, or in the more traditional sense of brimstone, the word garith means like burning stone, so that's where you get burning stone from. It might or might not be the element sulfur, although there's sulfur in that region, so perhaps that's associated with it. Out of heaven. So the fact it's raining, or literally out of the sky, it's raining out of the sky from the same place that water rain comes from, is highlighting against those who would try to explain this as an earthly phenomenon, as an earthquake or volcano or something like that. There certainly were and are earthquakes in this area, and it's an active geological area. But that's not the point. The point here is not to try to explain this away as some natural phenomenon that's only attributed to God because people are too stupid to understand science. These people were not stupid, although they obviously didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have in the modern world. But this is plainly meant to be an act of God, something that breaks what we would call, but they didn't have a notion of, the laws of nature. For us, that tends to separate out in an enlightenment mode between the natural realm and the supernatural realm, and the quote laws of nature apply in the natural realm. So if God does something that violates those, we call it supernatural. But the ancient world had no notion of that. That's a notion that comes to the Enlightenment with people like Newton, trying to understand how there could be a powerful God and yet these observable laws of nature that God was not necessarily subject to. So that kind of notion is completely foreign to the Bible. So it is an act from God, but it's an act from the sky from God, and not an act from the earth. It's not a matter of disrupting the earth. It's a matter of heaving this down and overthrew those cities, which is specifically Sodom and Gomorrah, but in the tradition, as we'll see, can also include a quartet of 4 cities. And that's repeated twice here in those cities. And all the plain. Those cities and all the plain, and all those who were settled in those cities. And literally it means all those sitting, but it's the word yashav here for settled. It'll come out 3 times in verse 30. And it's such a key word in Genesis, we'll see later, that the next time there's violence from the people in this lineage, it'll be Jacob and his wife and daughters, or his sons and his one daughter, who is raped by the prince of a city. And it'll be precisely because Jacob is settled when he was supposed to keep moving. So this issue of settling rather than continuing to move, as Abraham and Sarah have, will be a key aspect of this. So it's focusing on those who are settled were destroyed here. And further, what grew on the ground. And this is one of those rare words here. And it's an interesting question here because this is growing from the Adamah and suggesting not just all vegetation, but agriculture, which is to say it's undoing at one level the damage done by the actions of human based on the curse in Genesis 3, which is being sentenced to fight with the earth for food. So, and of course, agriculture is the basis of urban life then and now. Not agriculture in the city, but agriculture outside the city that the city controls through slavery and violence and military means and war and all the usual ways in which powerful human forces control the fertility of the earth or of other cultures. So that's all being destroyed. It's a blank slate here, fresh start, parallel to the flood story. So before we continue into verse 26, let's take a look at how this image plays out in other parts of the Hebrew Bible. So we can see the image of fire and sulfur in the psalm here. We don't know the date of the psalm, relatively speaking, to Genesis, but plainly Isaiah and Ezekiel. Isaiah is certainly from before the exile, and Ezekiel is probably contemporaneous with Genesis, writing from Babylon. And so we saw here that Isaiah anticipates a day of Yahweh's judgment against the Assyrians, which would, of course, have been against the kingdom that controlled Israel, as opposed to Babylon controlling Judah. And then a little later in Isaiah, streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and that same kind of image. But notice this is about a day of vengeance that hasn't happened, or a year of vindication, which plays out again in Isaiah 61 and the famous passage of his Jubilee that Jesus calls upon in Luke 4. These are all about some future occasion, so they haven't happened yet. And the similar thing here in Ezekiel, I will pour down torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur, but it hasn't actually happened in Ezekiel's time. So that's what we get there. But in the New Testament, we get this from Luke, where Luke's Jesus likens the fate of Jerusalem to that of Sodom, much like the prophets before him. And he likened this on the day that the human one, or Son of Man, will be revealed. But the primary place is in the book of Revelation, and that's not too surprising that this image of fire and sulfur is one that John would take up as he describes the final destruction of empire in relation to the image of Sodom. And of course, in Revelation, he likens Jerusalem explicitly to Sodom when he speaks about the place that the two witnesses' dead bodies will be left in the street of the great city, called prophetically or literally in the Greek, called in the spirit Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. So when John is using this image of fire and sulfur, which he says in his image is not coming down from the sky, but is in a lake that's burning with fire and sulfur, maybe that's the reservoir that was created by the rain falling down upon Sodom so long ago. He's likening this both to Sodom and to Egypt and to Jerusalem and to Rome and to Babylon, which is to say, for him, all cities become the great city that oppress humanity and prevent God's will from being done on earth as it is in the sky. So with that, we turn to Lot's wife. And then we get to verse 26. And it's such a curious thing because it's one of the most famous verses in the Bible, and yet this character has no name and no voice at all, does one thing: she looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. This is certainly a function of patriarchy here, that she's not mentioned at all, and it's by name. And the fact that she's not mentioned by name certainly highlights both with Sarah and with Hagar, to the extent that Hagar is a name and not just a title, the immigrant or the refugee. But Sarah is certainly a name, and Yahweh changed Sarai's name to Sarah. But Lot's wife doesn't get a name. Is that because of Yahweh? No, I'd suggest it's plainly because of Lot and the life in the city, that in the concentric circle areas that we saw, it was all male space other than the woman's own body. Even inside the house, the man was controlling the space in the face of the Sodomites coming out. So as we saw Sarah and Abraham inside the tent acting as equals, or if anything, Abraham following Sarah's lead, which will happen again in chapter 21 in relation to Hagar and Ishmael, as we'll see. Here, Lot's wife in this urban context has no voice, no agency whatsoever, walking behind her man, not even with a name, and she dares to do one thing, looks back, and she's transformed. We'd already heard the prohibition against looking back. Had she heard that? Maybe he didn't tell her any more than Abraham told Sarah about the covenant of circumcision back in chapter 17 and the promise that she would have a child come next spring. So we don't know anything about that, but Lot has not spoken to his wife or about his wife or had any regard for it all. And when this happens, there's no expression of regret or grief at all. Much in great contrast to Abraham, who will greatly grieve Sarah as he tries to buy a piece of land to bury her in chapter 23. And that she becomes a pillar of salt has become proverbial, but it also has become topographic, because if you were to go to the Dead Sea, you could see Lot's wife right here, or at least what's purported to be Lot's wife. Because this is such a sexist and patriarchal element, I thought it would be interesting to link here this from a group of Jewish women's collective providing a feminist look on the traditional midrash on Lot's wife. So I won't go over it here in this video, but I'll provide the link on the web page or on the YouTube page here, and we'll be able to see that there. But it's a fascinating thing to hear how the rabbis took account of Lot's wife and what happened to her. And so with Lot apparently on his way to Zoar, and his wife turned into a pillar of salt, apparently his daughters must be with him, the scene shifts to Abraham. And as Westerman suggests, there is something majestic about the conclusion of the narrative. The movement freezes in the awe-inspiring horror of the sight, and I think that's a pretty fair way to put it. It's the last time we've seen Abraham since 1833, when he left with his conversation with Yahweh about whether the city would be saved if they found 10 decent people, and the other two went on over Sodom. And so now he returns to that spot when early in the morning, a refrain that we'll hear throughout much of Abraham's life, of this early in the morning, to where he stood before Yahweh, where the two men, now described as angels, went down toward Sodom. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward the land of the plain, and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. And it's quite an image there to see Abraham looking down upon the entire burning plain, not knowing if Lot survived or not. Whether it's because of the distance or because of the smoke that covers it up, he ends up going away and not knowing whether his argument or his debate about justice with God was successful in saving his nephew Lot or not. And so we get to the final conclusion from the narrator. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham. And that's, of course, an echo from 8:1, where God remembered Noah and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. And so finally, the narrator attributes it to that God does remember Abraham, whether that's remembering the discussion that we saw or just remembering Abraham in general, providing mercy, as the angel suggested that God was doing for Lot. Even though Lot lingered, and even though Lot was unwilling, he's removed from the overthrow, and he's not destroyed, and yet he still has a choice to make, which we'll see next time. But notice that it ends on a dark word, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. So now what will happen to this man who was terrified of moving into the hills and insisted on settling in a small city? We'll see what happens when his daughters perceive wrongly that they're the last humans left on earth. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.